Hello and welcome to another episode of Panel on Panels, the podcast about all things comics and comics related. I'm your host, John Campbell. Joining me as always, my co-host, Mike Gergoni.
Greetings.
And Mr. Donovan Eilert.
Hi, everybody. How's it going?
All right. You probably noticed that there's a brand new theme song for Panel on Panels.
It's so catchy.
It is our 52nd episode. We've been doing this for a year now, so we kind of
We haven't been shut down.
We have not been shut down.
Please don't shut us down if you have that power. Or try to.
Yeah, hopefully not.
I think people have been trying. It's just they've been failing because most people don't have that power, and we haven't pissed off iTunes quite enough yet.
Not yet. We're almost there, though. We're on the rickety edge with that for sure. But we want to thank Nolan Staples for making that theme song for us. It is our 52nd episode. We're a year in. We're very excited. We do have some special guests with us. We are very thrilled to have the Pander brothers on the show, Arnold and Jacob Pander.
Hello.
Hello. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
How are you guys?
We're
good.
We're good.
Good?
Yeah.
You know, we got through week one of our Kickstarter, so we're a little, we're getting it. We're getting into cruising altitude now.
That's right.
Cool.
Okay, very cool. Yeah. People familiar with you guys have been around for quite a while in the comics industry.
It's adding up.
Yeah. We every
not
once in a while
52 years yet, but
we run into people and they're like, I thought you guys would be a lot older. Yeah.
we've been moisturizing for the last decade.
Gotta moisturize. Drink lots of liquids.
I feel like Stan Lee could learn a lesson from that.
He's got.
Yeah,
You know,
well, you know.
he has no excuse. He's legitimately getting up there. You know?
Yeah, he's just starting to get old now.
Yeah, we're trying to catch up.
Yeah.
But and we are.
But we're a comic book podcast. We always love to talk about people's origins, specifically in relation to comic books. So it's something I always like to ask people is, do you guys remember like the first comic that really clicked you into the medium? You're like, oh wow, this is.
Well, we
something I love.
I know we had this. Our mom had this incredible book that was like, and I think you can still get it. It was like the Encyclopedia of Comics, and I remember that at a really young age.
She got it for like birthday or Christmas
but we're
or
talking
something.
like I might have been 3 years old or something. So just seeing everything from like Crazy Cat to Little Orphan Annie to some of the early superhero comics, because given this was like in the early 70s, when we were toddlers. So, and I remember this image that really stood out to me, Arnold.
Who is this?
This being Arnold. This really cool image of a Tales of Suspense cover with Iron Man, the gray, or actually he was in the gold mode by then.
Okay.
It was like maybe 42.
But still pretty Buckethead.
Very Buckethead. Very like clunky, but gold. And so there was some like woman in it, like a Medusa type character, some sort of femme fatale in there, like casting some spell, and he was tumbling over. And it just really was this huge page they devoted to it. And it just captured my imagination as a kid of like, wow, what is this? And very kind of a sci-fi image, I guess, for me.
Yeah. And I don't know. There used to be a show in Portland called Sinister Cinema, way back in the day, and I was way too young to be up late watching this.
Sure.
It would come on, and it was like a double feature horror thing.
Yeah.
And there was this host, Victor Ives, who wore a long cape and the beard and the whole thing. And but between the two movies, they would show these movie serials, and I discovered the Flash Gordon serials.
Oh, yeah.
And I kind of around that time, I discovered the original Alex Raymond Flash Gordon comics, which completely blew my mind in terms of just the drawings in it, and especially kind of in his like mid-period, the precision of his drawings of figure art. And all of that just really inspired me. So that was probably some of the early stuff that really got me going. And then, of course, discovering Will Eisner's The Spirit and the whole kind of the moodiness and that whole
Tintin was another one that
Tintin for sure was a real early inspiration, thing. So
I mean, really iconic stuff. Certainly, that you guys were latching onto. It sounded like
he bought me my first Iron Man comic too. I remember I kind of got turned back onto it because I was like 10 years old or something, and then you bought me an Iron Man or brought it back for like comic store. And
Christmas
it was like,
or something.
Yeah, or something. And it was like George Tuska was the artist, who was kind of like not really very popular. But
it's not a name that's thrown around a lot.
Yeah, it's like the Tuska look, But he had that really emblematic. He was kind of a pinup artist. He did Buck Rogers and comic strips in the 50s, and so he was kind of like a commercial artist, but he had this sort of emblematic style that was kind of easy to copy if you were young. So, and the poses were very kind of they were kind of stiff in a way, but they were also very bold and graphic. And so I did, he was sort of an early influence as well. So I became an Iron Man kid.
You're an Iron Man kid?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
You're still an Iron Man kid?
I kind of am, and I don't know why, because he's such a kind of he's like military industrial complex. But when I must say, when the movie came out, I was pleasantly surprised and was kind of I felt like a little kid watching that.
Oh yeah,
it was so great.
I mean, that was amazing, obviously, and kicked off that empire now that is.
Oh my god,
Marvel Entertainment.
And actually had a moment at a Comic-Con in 2009 with Robert Downey Jr.
Really,
that was pretty funny, but it was. We don't have to go into all that, but it was sort of like
you can if you want to.
Well, it was sort of one of those, like, we were there for it was the Tasty Bullet year. It was the 2009.
Okay. Right, Tasty Bullet.
And then we were in an elevator.
We were at a party at
W or something?
Something like that on the roof, and then
they
kicked everybody out because we got another party we got to start. And then, so everybody was in late afternoon, early evening, kind of buzzed, and pushed into an elevator,
going down to the lobby, and then all of a sudden it stops on the third floor, and kind of bing, and the door opens, and there's Robert Downey Jr. in full on Tony Stark mode, ready to go to his promotional party or whatever. Right. And he's kind of got one of his handlers next to him, and he kind of looks in the elevator at all these people that are staring back at him, sort of and there's this kind of and everybody in the in the elevator is like, there's this collective kind of awkward moment, and then all of a sudden, almost like we were all psychically connected in the elevator, we're all like, "Come on in," and then he's sort of like, okay, why not? 'Cause, he's party
just
guy.
He's
ready
elevator.
to hang out. So he sort of finds his way right dead center in the middle of the elevator. Doors close. We start keep going.
Silence.
And I had been in the process of handing someone a flyer, which is kind of one of our things. It was because we were actually premiering our feature film at Comic-Con that night. And so I just was like, well, anyway, so I started talking to the guy back. Oh yeah, so it's at 7:00 and blah blah blah. And so and they go, oh thanks. And then I look up and literally there's Robert Downey Jr. 2-3 heads in front of me looking back at me, sort of with this look of I don't even know how to describe it, sort of oh.
Is this your party?
Is this about you? Is this your elevator and you just do whatever you want, And I kind of gave him the look yeah, that's pretty much. Pretty much. Kind of, and he was like, okay. No words were spoken. It was all just... eyes and...
The subtext was there.
Yeah, the understanding was there, and then bing, he was gone into his black SUV, never to be seen again.
Of course, but still, you shared airspace with Tony Stark.
Yes,
and eye contact.
We had a moment.
Yeah, there you go. You had a moment. So, obviously, you're comic book fans growing up. At what point does it become, this is something we want to do?
Well, a lot of it...
Good question.
It was... before it was something like career thinking, something we want to do, we just were really inspired. We grew up with artist parents, so both our mom was an artist and our dad is also a painter and an artist.
Wow, okay.
So we were kind of steeped in it, and there was a lot of drawing and creating stuff as kids. And then
school newspaper.
Then we kind of really started collaborating in high school, and in particular with this comic that we did in the school newspaper, Gamma World. Kind of apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic
lots of mutants,
right?
And right.
And
possibly based off the D&D setting.
There was a actual game.
Yeah, there was a role-playing game called Gamma World.
Yeah, I may or may not own it on my shelf over there.
Right, there it is. That was kind of
obscure. Played it briefly, and then it
eventually got turned into a. This is going to be going deep nerd here. Eventually, it was picked up by Wizards of the Coast and turned into a setting for Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, okay.
But yes, it was
it
quasi,
was absorbed.
not very obscure, popular. Not really RPG, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I remember the box cover was kind of colored pencil, really bad kind of art.
Really
I don't
primitive.
know. Gamma World Year One,
1979.
That makes so much sense to me. You guys being Marvel fans and stuff. That Gamma World, Gamma's always such a big part of that Marvel universe.
That's a trip.
That's a read.
Yeah, I think I had it must have been the.
Gregoni's holding up the box.
I had the box probably that the folks that created it were this is we made 50 of these or something. It was like
It's gonna look something
garage.
like
it
this.
looked like I was
Yeah.
like in Eugene.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that was kind of our like, let's, it was also kind of Reagan era, kind of still in the Cold War,
Sure.
the sort of fear of the bomb was still
Oh yeah,
there,
stuff like
so-
the day after and
Oh
things
yeah,
like
the
that.
day
Yeah.
after,
Mhm.
and so we were kind of, and that hadn't even come out yet. So it was still like, but having dreams about like, oh my god, what if a bomb drops? And so we were, pretty angsted out as kids already about that prospect of growing up in a future that was kind of, uncertain and
Maybe like a Mad Max kind of.
is
Yeah,
before
or
that.
just-
I mean,
wow.
maybe Mad Max 1 was
Just
out, but
obliteration.
It's just
Yeah.
this
Well,
fear of like
yeah,
this.
It was probably before.
Yeah,
It was kind of around when Star Wars came out.
Well, it was like we're talking like 1980. So like MTV just
Okay,
started.
yeah.
Truly the apocalypse.
It was the apocalypse. There you go.
the beginning
yeah.
of the end. Yeah.
Leo Sayer had his music videos.
Oh no! All right, yeah, then we're in trouble for sure.
Yeah, the world was ending. So we thought, well, we better draw as much as we can. But it was kind of when we started to call ourselves the Pander Brothers because we were kind of drawing on these panels, and Jacob was already, was a little older, so he was just better at everything, drawing,
Damn him.
But I was trying to catch up, and I was a little more in the kind of superhero, characters, and so I kind of created this character of my own, and so I was like, I'm signing this panel because I created this character. So we were like kids, and so Jacob was like, well, all right. So we kept, and he was, well, I did this big spaceship. So, so we were like signing these panels, like this is getting ridiculous. So we kind of, settled on, why don't we just go by the Pander Brothers? And,
That's interesting because that'd be prior to sort of this like wave of, especially like in film, all the brothers, the Coen brothers.
It
and
wasn't
all that
really
stuff.
thinking of it like the term branding wasn't really there.
Right.
So we
yeah.
weren't really thinking like
you guys
that. It was
were.
more
You guys
like-
were ahead of the game.
That seems to be a problem. Yeah, we're not marketing it well enough. We're just doing it, But that was kind of I think in a lot of ways it was just a way of kind of being, but
was
settling
kinda-
an
I mean-
argument.
Yeah, it kind of started out of that, but then locally, like in Portland, where we grew up.
I was going to ask, you guys are Portland natives.
Yeah, we're Portland
Very
natives
cool.
and grew up here, and so a lot of the early stuff that we were doing was, as soon as we got out of high school, we were doing rock posters and album covers,
yeah.
and then kind of as a way to get our name out there, we would just make a really emblematic Pander Bros on the poster, and people really started to kind of get that in their head locally, and then they wouldn't even call us by it; they'd just be like, "Hey, Pander Bro," or whatever. So we kind of, and so in a weird way, we did really kind of just without even thinking of it, create a brand.
Yeah.
And it was really around that time that Arnold had some artwork up at Future Dreams bookstore on Burnside, and Matt Wagner had come through town, and he was doing a book tour for Mage, and came and saw some of the art hanging up in the wall at Future Dreams, and through Don, who owns Future Dreams, was able to get in touch with Arnold.
I think I just came in there to like see if one of my
Oh,
drawings
maybe that was
sold.
it. It was like, oh, by the way,
$20 for a Wolverine drawing, or
right?
And
then
sorry, Marvel.
But we basically were asked to put do these sample pieces for this book, Grendel.
So we were I actually had I'd worked at Future Dreams briefly in high school, and then I quit to pursue our creative endeavors and basically kind of move into new interests. But I had the art there. Had an issue of Grendel in the Black and White series, and so I was familiar with the character.
Yeah,
but then they had sort of like said, well, top secret, it's going to be a female, and
right.
We want some action pages, we want some kind of more moody pages just to get a sense of your storytelling. And we just had that we were already in a way moving away from kind of the comic book influences and really getting more into fashion and more into filmmaking. And Jacob was really wanting to move into film direction, and I wanted to basically be a fashion illustrator. I was kind of
interesting.
Really wanting to kind of move to New York and explore that, and Jacob to Hollywood. So we were kind of in this like, okay, we're doing this now, but eventually we were dreaming still of, well, what is to come? We didn't really have, and at that point, we were pretty, kind of living on the edge. It was all like, okay, we have enough money to get some pizza and a beer, or not even beer, like coffee or a Coke, and kind of like, okay, so it was a little on the raw side, and so when suddenly we had this opportunity, it was kind of like, okay, let's just do these pages, and we'll do it as the Pander Brothers. Even though it was me being asked, it was like, well, we're the Pander Brothers, so let's just do this and make it badass. And it was that weird thing of like it just felt natural to be drawing comics, but because we didn't have that kind of rigid thinking of like, oh, it has to look like a comic book. It was like we were breaking through panels, and we were bringing in like. And definitely Miller's Daredevil, I remember having some influence, and Dark Knight had maybe just come out.
Well,
So
I mean, if
things
you're
were
drawing a
getting
comic in
more
the
noir.
80s, how could you not be inspired by
Oh,
Frank
yeah,
Miller?
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I'm just thinking, but I remember, like, doing one of those scenes where the character's flipping and you see her, like...
Multiple moves.
Multiple six
Oh.
characters of her flipping around in the sample.
The Donovan is what we call it.
The Donovan? Oh,
Yeah, we've been trying to on this
Who did we
podcast.
talk to about this?
does
When
that-
It was Brennan. It was Brennan Wagner.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, is there a name for that technique? And he said no, and I suggested the Donovan. So if you guys could just kind of keep passing that along.
we're just trying.
that would
Everybody
be-
who comes on, we
You
try
don't
to.
have to use the last
I
name.
think,
Just the
I think
Donovan.
Sunshine
You gotta have a-
Superman, but okay.
You got to have a few Donovans in an issue.
That's
That's right.
So,
Yeah,
And obviously-
one quotient. Yeah. So I think it was the Donovan. The guy that sealed the deal.
yeah,
Cool.
That got us
Bumped it over the edge.
It's going to come back in like 3 years. Somebody's going to call it that on some panel we're at,
Yeah.
and it's going to be like, yes,
And you'll be like, I
I'm
invented
Donovan.
that. And be like, whatever, dude.
yes, this guy in his 20s invented that technique.
Hey, you
Sure,
never know.
Miller was doing. No, it's me.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then Grendel was a book that really lent itself to that kind of artwork as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of, like I said, we were very influenced by what was very contemporary to a 17, 18-year-old and a 19-year-old. I mean, that's how old we were when we were drawing it. So it was suddenly like being thrust into this sort of world of comics, the industry comics, but we were kind of drawing it from a perspective of like, let's draw what we think is cool, which is what people, a lot of the best stuff comes from that. It's
Oh,
just, like,
absolutely, yeah.
what we're seeing around us, what we're vibing on. And if you really look at Grendel, it kind of evolves as it goes, that 12-issue run that we did.
Yeah,
She
oh, for
gets
sure,
darker. It kind of goes from like that poppy look that was more mid-'80s
Right.
till more kind of goth. And because we went from listening to Duran Duran to listening to the Cult,
Right.
and Love and Rockets. It was like,
It's a natural
it was
progression.
Bauhaus. It was like by the end we were like deep into Bauhaus, and it was like dark,
Yeah, and obviously that was sort of like that was also cool because you guys are on the forefront of obviously a big change in the story of Grendel, switching to this new female
Right.
character.
Yeah, and that was interesting too because she was like a really complicated person.
Oh, for sure,
and
yeah.
very but she was sort of the whole notion of the Grendel mythos and the sort of the beast within kind of, and the justifying the actions of extreme violence and retribution. So she's sort of a.
In that sense, it was kind of a noir, female noir character, which I think lent itself to the just growing up in rainy, dark Portland, and
A
back
very
then,
noir kind of city,
It's a
yeah.
noir city, and back then even more so because there was, now it's a very like
no Pearl District.
tons of business. Yeah, it was
Right.
It's true. It was
Damn,
just
Pearl just seems to keep getting bigger.
it was
yeah.
dark, little gritty streets and brick buildings and fire escapes, and that kind of found its way into Grendel quite
yeah.
a bit. That mood. So.
So it was as though we were kind of all the the right pieces were in place for that to work.
And then something I'm fascinated by your guys' process, sort of. Now you both draw. Mm-hmm. How does that work? I mean, like, how do you keep that?
It's
look
evolved
consistent,
over time. I mean,
Well, we
basically. Well, I mean, so I, essentially, Arnold at a certain point really started to excel in figure drawing. Mm-hmm. And so, and as we were collaborating, I was, starting to really excel at doing perspective drawing, complex environments and stuff. And so we kind of, complicated guns.
I was going to say, there's some excellent guns in all your books,
lethal
I think.
weapons.
I can't take that.
So I mean, I think we kind of found our little space in which to do this stuff really economically and productively, and kind of went from there. And so, I mean, I think the comic that's got the most of my kind of twisted figure art, because my stuff tends to be a little more warped.
He makes a cameo once in a while.
Yeah, right. So if
Freaks
you see the freaks in there, yeah. But as Exquisite Corpse, we decided,
yeah.
well, I'll draw all the weird doctors and the
Okay,
weird,
sure,
and
yeah.
so you're like, they have to take on a really particular persona.
Their
but,
heads are not. It's like, is there?
how
do you get the brain
what's the
in that
shape of
head?
that skull? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, because I mean, you guys definitely. I mean, you can see it in that first Grendel book. You have a very distinctive style, for sure. I can recognize Pander Brothers art when I see it.
Thank you.
Even though it does evolve and change with each thing, for sure.
Yeah, I mean that kind of became, part of our process too, was allowing ourselves to do that, not kind of falling into too much of a formula. I mean, when I think about the Grendel, book, that when it was really, what it hit hard and it hit in a way that was true to the time.
Oh yeah.
Whether had we stayed in that style, I mean, even Ginger Fox kind of was like pseudo, stylized, clean line, but we started really stretching it, and people started looking kind of Picasso-esque, and we kind of took it into a more, almost like you're in a abstract dream world or something. So we were kind of just entertaining ourselves in the process too, like, okay, let's stretch this out, let's take this somewhere new, let's not just get into this rigid sort of framework of this is what people liked before, so let's keep doing this but with new characters but with the same look. And so we just would allow the project to kind of, in a way, dictate the style that we would draw it in. So say Exquisite Corpses is a good example. I mean, we were really, at that time, kind of, we'd already kind of gone back to Europe and started to kind of, I think, getting more into, going to museums and sort of seeing more like fine art and taking in more of these kind of, these influences of like German Expressionism and Otto Dix and George Gross and all these kind of artists that were considered degenerate artists in the
by the Nazis,
and
right?
whatnot. So we were
outcasts.
I mean, the Nazis had like opinions about things, and they were coming down on things. What?
They
were a little harsh.
They had a
a little harsh. We can take that away.
The problem was people let them talk and keep talking, and then somehow then they got serious.
So I think everybody was kind of degenerate to the Nazis, actually.
Yeah, pretty much. It was a very easy to, So so we were falling in line with the degenerates. Let's continue the degenerate.
Like, these are our guys.
Vision.
Right?
Yeah, those are. Well, they'd all run off to America anyway, so they were
Right.
So they were American.
I feel like if you'd come down on the other side, there might have been a problem.
Yeah, that could have been. Yeah,
But the comics would be a lot different.
I don't know. I don't know if I even want to elaborate on that. If I ever want to work again in the.
You don't have to.
Okay.
I was going to say, though, your work in particular is the total opposite of any kind of option or anything like that. It's frequently very anti that stuff.
Yeah, well,
as it should be.
Yeah, well, we live in a political world.
Well, we do, and our parents were of that age of, our dad actually was, as a young kid, he grew up in Nazi-occupied Holland, so he literally has memories of the Nazis marching right outside his front door.
We're knocking on the door. And
knocking on the door.
Your dad,
Yeah, our grandfather had to hide from the Nazis because they were trying to round up all of the able-bodied men during the kind of Battle of the Bulge and the Hunger Winter to get them out there to fight. So we kind of grew up with a lot of of that.
I wouldn't say they were, it wasn't like we were growing up in this heavy activism. It's just that we are, that was part of the tapestry, the history, our father being from, a foreign land and being here as a Dutch citizen and kind of in our mom's American. So we kind of had, and our father's world was really, because they separated, and so our father was really kind of found a new community in the counterculture here, and theater and politics obviously kind of folded into that, because it was definitely like in the Vietnam era. So we were kind of some of that rubbed off, and we again grew up. Our coming of age, as it were, was during kind of that Reagan and then into Bush 1 and all those kind of, just that the era was a little darker, and it wasn't a real sense, at least from the side of the street we were on, that we had a really great future ahead.
Right.
So it was so some of that, even though, but what's amazing about it, and you look at Grendel's a great example, is we were kind of those kids that were like, well, we're not going to let that be the narrative,
Right.
just like the great music that came the punk rock. I mean, a lot of
sure,
that was motivated out of social unrest, and yet that music is still holds up to this day because it was from a really deep, passionate, creative place, and I think that the great creativity can come out of those periods of time.
When you look at the comics of that era too, I mean, you mentioned things like Dark Knight Returns. I mean, the comics were getting very political at that time. Watchmen, things like that. That were very much about that.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you guys are coming up in so you guys obviously you did the art on Grendel. At what point did you sort of segue into we want to write our own stuff as well?
Well, what's interesting is like really Grendel. So we were both born in Amsterdam, but we came back over. Our dad immigrated when I was about 3 and Arnold was about 1. So we grew up here, but we really always wanted to go back. And our dad has 9 brothers and sisters, so there's a lot of family out there. And so when we did Grendel, before it even came out, it allowed us to actually buy plane tickets and go back and visit. And it was really on that trip in late 1986, I think October 1986, that the very spark of the Dissident, aka XXX, was formed, and so really as soon as we possibly could, we wanted to get at the reins of writing. Because we had, obviously we were kids and we'd written the stuff in the school newspaper. You know how qualified that makes you, I don't know. But
I'm going to write this thing.
But we were, we were very ambitious youngsters, I guess. And
For sure, yeah.
So we really just immediately started percolating, and as we were doing these other projects like Ginger Fox and I think maybe we did a few small things, but it was really quite within a year.
Pretty quickly. I mean, we were trying to. I mean, we were like wanting to ink more of the Grendel series, like and do more writing. And I remember when we did Ginger Fox, like Mike Barron was kind of like
a lot of projects.
A lot of projects, and this was like not on the top of his list. And we were like, well, why don't you let us plot it? And we did some plotting on that. That he kind of was like, okay, yeah, you guys got it up and running. I'll take it from here. So we were just like, whatever we could get our hands on. And so when we finally got the chance to kind of sink our teeth into XXX, the Dissident, we were kind of like, that really was where we cut our teeth as writers.
And so that was really the first major writing project that we did.
Other than some short films that we couldn't,
Right, there was stuff.
All the film stuff went.
So was it always kind of like comics and film side by side for you guys?
Well, at first the comics really dominated, and that's really where we kind of went. Okay, this is.
Well, career-wise,
this is we're off and running in this. So but there were short film projects that were like, very ambitious as well, but very costly that we couldn't do. But we were doing like these kind of experimental short films and just kind of, a little bit again, kind of on the edgier, dark side, 16 millimeter short films, and then we got kind of into doing. The music video thing kind of started to come into play because we really wanted to do more film work, but music videos, then you could actually, there were budgets, and MTV had these kind of like, I don't know if you remember 120 Minutes, which was kind of like an alternative music wing of MTV, and so there was an outlet for, what was kind of becoming the alternative sound, and so we did a music video, I remember, for a band called, a Portland band called Dharma Bums, and they were sort of like kind of in that grunge era. So that's kind of fast forward a bit. But we were working on XXX, and we were that because that project kind of took so long to do. There was penciling. We lived in Europe for 2 years off and on, writing and then penciling, and then suddenly we had to ink this juggernaut of a book, 336-page graphic novel.
So we basically moved to San Francisco, where at the time we didn't really know anybody, so that we would not be distracted. Because it's really easy to be like, oh, let's go with us.
Well,
became monks for a year.
We did become monks, but we got it done. But it was
just getting that gold leafing down on those first letters of every single page.
Right.
You're not too far off.
Yeah.
All those bricks.
Don't over ink page 1. Then you're like,
you set the precedent, right?
So you guys do the Dissident, and then you come back from Europe then and go, we want to try to sell this.
It's funny, we had pitched the Dissident, and so actually I think to Kamiko.
Yeah, they were still. So Bob and Diana Schutz. Well, they were married at the time.
Yeah, friend of the show, Bob Schreck.
Yes. Now they were. Yes,
everything comes back to every guest we've had. If that name comes up every time,
she's touched
us all.
And she's like my white whale as a guest. I've got to get Diana Schutz on the show.
She's great
because she's mentioned in almost every episode of our show.
She's now she's a professor. She's teaching.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, we've. I think most of us here have taken classes either taught by her or she's been a part of.
Okay.
We were in a class once, and she came in and sat down as a student, and we were all like, Is that Diana Shuts?
A murmur throughout the room.
The best part is she wasn't there like 3 weeks into the class, and the professor was like, "Hey guys, just so you know, when I picked this reading list, 3 of which Diana edited, I didn't realize she was taking the class."
Yeah.
So it's like a little perspective for you guys.
I'm as freaked out as
yeah,
anybody.
Like, we're in this together because it's like,
That's great.
We're all sweating bullets. Here.
yeah, it's like, but you
Yeah.
can't pick books without her name on it. I mean, that's like
Yeah. No, it's
statistically impossible at this point, right? Like
Yeah.
you have 10 books, one of them she touched.
She definitely. She had quite an impact, both her and Bob. I mean, and we, owe a lot to them because they were pretty much, our true believers and really fought for us and for our visions at a really young age, and we had, we just had that kind of raw energy that was going into it. They recognized that, and even though we weren't kind of coming up through the comic industry or I mean, obviously Grendel gave us some footing, but we really had to kind of earn it. They wanted us to like go back. No, this isn't working. When we pitched the original version of the Dissident, it was really like they were like, "This sounds cool. Yeah, send us what you got." And we sent it. They're like, "This doesn't sound like what you were talking about. Go back to it." And so we went back. Okay, and then so that it did take longer. We thought, okay, we'll get this thing written and drawn.
Oh
and
yeah,
boom,
no,
boom.
we were
It's
very
like,
confident. We were very confident enough to like close down our apartments, get on an airplane, move to Europe for a year with kind of like, oh yeah, we'll write this and then we'll pitch it and then we'll start just getting our checks and we're going to do it. And then we like get there, we're 3 months in and we're like, okay, we finally got this thing together, and we send it off and they're like, yeah, no.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh my God,
okay.
we're in Amsterdam and we need a job. Oh no.
It's not legal for us to work here.
Yeah, but it was good. I mean, then it really did force us to kind of like go deeper, as they say, and get really into it and refine it.
Yeah.
And then
And at that time,
that whole first year was spent living and immersing ourselves in the whole world out there, and then writing this thing.
And that world involved kind of like these squatters and the kind of
Amsterdam
political,
underground,
kind of underground, and house music was breaking.
we were listening to pirate radio.
Yeah, listening to pirate radio, which would eventually find itself in another project.
Yeah,
but
secret broadcast.
Secret broadcast. But we were very like steeped in this world that was very foreign to us, but also very exotic, and was more in a way like we came from a much rougher version of that in Portland. And so you get there and it's like, it's a socialist country, and people are like, well, we'll go to the protest and then we'll go have a a nice glass of wine later and talk about, it's like, it's a little, I mean, there were some real rebels there, no doubt about it. And they would, I think they felt more confident to just turn over a cop car because they knew they weren't going to get shot. So, we were like, okay. So, there was a kind of a different perspective on protest. It was almost part of their tradition. But when we came back to Portland, and we were still writing the thing. We hadn't sold it yet, and now Dark Horse was the new kid on the block, and Kamiko was kind of out, and Bob and Diana were with Dark Horse, and so it was a big transition happening in that world. But indie comics were still going strong, and so we basically were like, okay, wow, well, we're back in Portland, and it was like protests were breaking out.
The first Gulf War had started,
was heating up, and
there was like a presidential re-election. So I think it was like Bush and Quayle, like Daddy Bush, the older Bush, and his vice president Quayle.
And
they
that was
would
around
come
the
to
time.
town, and
that was around the time they
protests.
deemed, because of all the protests that were just erupting spontaneously with them being, within the city limits. They deemed it. I think Bush was on his way back to the airport, and they had to take a detour because of the protesters. And he was like, "What is this, Little Beirut?" And so Portland became Little Beirut for a while.
Yeah.
So we were, it was just that was the tone. And so we were living in this art co-op in downtown Portland, drawing Exquisite Corpses, writing the proposal for the Dissident. And then we finally pitched it, and this time they bid.
Cool.
Mike Richardson,
yeah. But he wanted to call it Triple X. So.
Why?
Well, I mean, Triple X was actually a working title for quite a while, and in Amsterdam, all of these different towns have a coat of arms, and the one for Amsterdam is the 3 crosses. So we thought, oh, well, let's play on that. But it was also a bit of a cheeky kind of nod to the Sin City aspect of Amsterdam.
Something they would definitely embrace later in Sin City.
Well, there you go. See, it all comes around.
Well, and it was sort of like, it was kind of just rebellious, but we never thought we would actually pitch it as Triple X. We thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, and it was like maybe a big newspaper and just had 3 X's on it, and it really works into the story. The paper in the story is called Triple X, this paper they resurrect that was cited silenced in the 90s. So we were like, okay, that's part of the story, but we didn't really think, we would call it that. But that somehow it connected with Mike, and he was like, well, if you guys will do it if you call it Triple X. And we were kind of like, okay, that we like that too, but we weren't really thinking like from a real practical standpoint. But we did, I think, in the back of our minds go like, maybe we should have, like this is kind of this guy. It's about this guy who's running away from his problems, thinking he can escape in sort of liberal-minded, like he can disappear in liberal-minded Amsterdam, but in reality, he's like no matter where you go, there you are, and he shows up there, and things are going crazy in their own right out there, and so he finds himself, because he's a journalist and he's just kind of a curious person, like getting to the bottom of it, and in a more, instead of raising the fist where all his peers and these sort of underground kids that have taken him in, because he's sort of like this notorious guy that escaped America, but they're confused by him.
After it's fallen under martial law. It's kind of future forward.
So we kind of enter Amsterdam like we imply what's happened to this character Hans, but we never really see it. And so but he just, other than in his face, he's just kind of post-traumatic stress. He's just traumatized. He just wants to vanish and disappear. And he's like, no, I don't. They're like, well, you're going to come to the protest later today, right? And he's like, yeah, no thanks, So he just wants to disappear, and in the process, they kind of wonder, well, who are you for real? And then he starts to kind of uncover this through other circumstances. He finds himself kind of uncovering this plot that all roads lead back to this this corporate leader who everyone's protesting against. So he becomes more investigator in a way.
Very cool. And something very exciting is you guys are working on I don't know what the term exactly is. So I only can go to a film term, like remastering this in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, it took quite a while to produce this book back in the day, and originally what we'd envisioned kind of from its very early inspiration was the notion of a kind of contemporary Tintin book. And so we had seen in our minds this book that would have these like really gorgeous detailed drawings of these like European cities, and in particular it would be Amsterdam, but with this beautiful color and this crystal blue skies and the dark, brick of the buildings and our characters in it,
but with flying cars.
With some flying
makes
cars.
everything cool.
Yeah, guys on jetpacks.
Flying cars and jetpacks make everything better.
Exactly. Just add jetpack, and so that was so we were like, well, we'll do it and we'll call it Triple X, but we definitely want it to be color, and so we signed a contract and was like, this is going to be the plan. But by the time we had produced all of that work, and it took several years to get to that final end game, the industry had totally changed, the economics of the industry.
Image Comics,
paper prices, just like the list goes on, and
drama.
So at the very,
like it.
Once we had moved back from San Francisco, where we had sat like monks for a year, inking it in black and white to be colored. So all of the black and white was it was very minimal. It was like
very linear.
Yeah, and so we were like, then we discovered, well, we're not going to print it in color, and we're like, oh my god, so we actually went back and did a whole nother pass at the 300 plus pages to kind of beef it out a bit so it would actually hold up in black and white. But so there it went to print, and it was a black and white book, and so ever since we've always felt that book that we set out to do was never really truly finished, never completed, never printed the way it was meant to be. And so we were recently able to get all of the actual original scanned files that Dark Horse had in their archive, and we've been slowly going through all of those, kind of cleaning up the artwork and kind of prepping it. And now we've just launched this Kickstarter to color the whole book and release it digitally online. And that's kind of like, we look at it as almost a phase one, getting the book colored, releasing it online, with a looking ahead of more long game is to potentially have it physically published as a book the way we had originally seen
and
it.
as well, doing a sort of a chapter 0, as it were. We don't really have a title for it, but kind of a prequel that takes place in New York, kind of the escape from
very nice.
New York.
An escape from New York?
Escape from New York.
There's your title. Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Right,
John Carpenter
escape,
could have a problem with that.
And end up in Sin City. It's going to be amazing.
Exactly.
Let's get everybody on you for legal issues.
That's good PR.
Yeah.
So but that story is really great, because one of the things, what's interesting about the Dissident, as it exists now, there's a lot of strange, predictions that we were kind of making about maybe one potential future, and in this future, at least in this story in Amsterdam, is a corporate leader who wants to run the country, and named Fexall. And it's
Sound familiar.
So, and there's all these, the poisoning of the Rhine, the water supply has all been tainted and poisoned, and that's been kind of more in the current ripped from the headlines. But these were just but basically dealing with population growth, kind of a social control. The environment, basic consolidation of power by corporations,
and media,
media basically being monopolized and also controlled to the degree that there's really only one source of news. And actually, of course, this is before iPads and iPhones and all that too. So we really have stripped out in this future all of everything, and so it's kind of this. So even the printed word is kind of a romantic notion or something that people don't have access to, and one of the characters, the sort of mentor character, is this old printer that was because the character Hans, in a almost pseudo-biographical way, has links to family out there from his grandfather who had been a writer for this paper XXX in the 90s, and so we kind of, even though we were drawing it in the 90s, we refer to the 90s as the distant past. And so this is in 2033 that it takes place. So we still have a little bit of future to kind of work with some
to get our jetpacks in.
But what we're going to do in that issue 0 is make the world look a little bit more like what we recognize. And with that in mind, maybe even a speculative, like what we, a move away from what we recognize in 10 years from now, because of maybe something that unfolds in a nefarious way that due to what we're doing on a daily basis with our phones and whatnot.
Sure.
So all of that kind of plays into this theme of Big Brother. Again, we thought, well, let's resurrect this in a way that's contemporary with an issue 0. That will come later. We really want to focus on the book itself. Now. And then we're developing a larger story world.
Very cool.
It.
And there's a Kickstarter you guys are doing for this.
Yes. So we are on week 2. We just started. We go till February 25th. So we are seeking support.
Or maybe by this, it'll be week 3. Maybe
Probably be
we're in
week 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess technically we'll be.
We're dealing with some time travel.
We're in the future.
We are now in the future.
And a gap for edit. And
Slice that out.
Yeah.
Because that's probably gone. You didn't hear that.
Thud.
Time travel. So that's
we
unfolding now.
Yeah, we're in the midst of the Kickstarter, and one of the things that we did mention that we're doing, and also is kind of connected to the fact that it'll be a digital release, is bringing in an interactivity to it. And so one of the things that throughout drawing the whole story, a lot of the scenes actually take place in actual locations in either Amsterdam or Rotterdam, all the way down to the underground kind of squatter club that we would go into, literally, and kind of tap on the door and a little slat would open up and they'd look at you and they'd be like, do you look like a rebel outlaw character or not? And then we like, oh, you guys, all right, we'll let you in.
Please tell me the password was swordfish.
It was sort of fish. But so a lot of those places we just drew, and in fact, even the interior of that particular place, one night I was like, oh, well, I need to get some photographs in here. Now, all over the place, you'd see these little signs that go, geen foto maken, no photos. And I thought, oh, just take a photo. And I go
a little too comfortable.
You go to take a photograph, and all of a sudden, and there's like all this like music going, and all of a sudden, all the music stops, and the lights come on top of me, and they're like, and I hear like this voice like "Geen foto maken" all over the loudspeaker, and these dudes come rushing in and literally grab me, and the camera goes flying, and I'm like, oh no, hey man,
we're all like, it's okay,
it's okay. I just was taking a photograph of my friend, and and they're like looking at us like, oh. And so then later I was like, well, I still got to get this interior. So then I came back with a sketchbook, and we just hung out like a week later, and I just kind of gridded out the entire interior like some spy. But so in the comic you get all that, but
what the interactive element is ultimately going to be is these, because these locations were so strict, true to form, and we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could actually go there and see what this place actually looks like? And so we'll be putting links in. We're basically creating a dedicated website for the Dissident called the DissidentDaily.com, where every day starting May 1st we will post one page, a page a day,
Nice.
over the course of the book itself. And within that, we'll have Google Map links that can hot link you from the panel to the actual
Locations in
where
Amsterdam.
the story takes
Yeah,
place.
that's awesome.
So it'll really kind of be this, in a way, you could actually use the book as a guide to see Amsterdam through the eyes of Hans Noble.
Nice.
So at the Dissident. So that's kind of, and in general, we've been wanting to do that because over the years, we've really tried to integrate our film and our media and other types of media projects into
definitely something I wanted to talk to you guys
Yeah.
about. Is you really are trying to take the medium or sort of merge the mediums in a lot of ways, which is kind of cool. I know with Secret Broadcast, you had sort of an accompanying soundtrack to it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that one was another kind of experiment, if you will. Like, hey, let's take this story, but we wanted to bring the life into it. We wanted people to read the story, but also be able to experience who the characters were and what the world that they're in sort of represents and sounds like. And we were getting into a lot of DJ culture at that time and pirate radio. Actually, Portland
This was
had
kind of done in the late 90s.
98.
Yeah.
So we'd been back, the Dissident come out as XXX. It kind of run its course, and we were kind of we needed a break from each other, actually. We were like, okay, you go off and make a film or something, and I'm going to go do this. I want to do this music, get into the music thing, and I actually started DJing. And so it was kind of just a period of kind of almost like taking a
Kind of
step back
a reset button.
bit of a reset button. But Secret Broadcast, well, basically Bob approached us because he was beginning Oni Press, and they needed to kind of get it off the ground. And Matt was doing a Jay and Silent Bob story, and then they approached us about doing something that we wanted to do, and it would be the other story. And we're like, well, we've got this idea, about this pirate radio kids, and simultaneously, just by coincidence or fate, you decide, there was this cool little pirate radio station.
Subterradio.
Subterradio. And it was run by DJ Shmeej, and he just would like randomly appear kind of like on at the end of the dial around 90.1.
All right, all you subterraneans.
All right. Listen to the beat. So he would just play these basically stuff like DJ Shadow and kind of that Ninja Tune sound, kind of down tempo and trip hop and DJ Crush, and so and even more sort of obscure electronic music. And so it was very kind of underground, but very fresh. It was like a sound that you weren't hearing certainly on Portland radio. And so that started kind of happening around the same time we were the germination of this idea and wanting to do something with pirate radio. So we kind of vibed off of each other, and we actually did we did like some joint fundraisers together and all that. So it was a pretty vibrant time in Portland for the sort of underground, and it was sort of post-grunge, so there was this vacuum in a way. There needed to be something new. So Secret Broadcast came out of that, and we did create the soundtrack that originally there was a limited version of the first printing where you could get the comic and the CD kind of together, but that was not very, it was costly for the company. So we found a distributor to distribute it as a CD, which actually I have here. But
I see.
And that actually, you could find at the time in Tower Records or record stores all over the country because it was
Back when those existed.
Back when those existed. So, which brings us to kind of this. Currently, we've been remastering a lot of the books, the stories that we own, the characters too, and coloring. Like that was a black and white story. We paid to have the color done for that. Actually, added some extra pages to the ending, and then did a whole new soundtrack with all new electronic music artists, and that one's called Secret Broadcast Redux, and that you can get on iTunes and Beatport and Amazon. As a downloadable CD, and what we've done is put the actual numbers, kind of the corresponding numbers, in the comic panels.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's the version of it I read on Comixology. And
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good.
yeah, it looks great. The
Thank you.
the
Thanks.
remastering of it certainly looks really nice. The color I enjoyed in that one
Yeah,
quite a bit.
It's interesting with the soundtrack on top of like something you're holding. The only other thing I can think of that's ever done that off the top of my head is Shadows of
the Empire. I knew that was right.
It was a Star Wars thing back from the
Mm-hmm.
mid to late '90s, where they released a soundtrack for the book that they did as well.
Right.
And I wish more things would do that, because you get a sound in your head for specific art and stuff that you read,
Right.
and it's good or I think it's good to have what the artists like, because I got to figure when you're drawing this or writing this, you have these sounds in your head, and to be able to put it down and then give it to people is like, no, this is what this sounds like.
This is the world,
like that's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, if you take it into even a bigger pop culture sense, I mean, you look at like Guardians of the Galaxy, for
Right.
instance,
Right, yeah.
I mean, what an amazing soundtrack that was, and that imagine being able to read the comic and have those songs
Sure.
embedded in the actual reading experience.
And similar to that, I mean, your Secret Broadcast, it was so important to the story, obviously. So much of it is based around the music. I mean,
Definitely.
in a different way, Guardians did that, but also
Yeah.
in that it's piped through this plot for a reason. It's not just listen
Yeah.
to this cool
Yeah.
song.
No,
Yeah.
you could. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's it. It's the tone of it, the kind of the ups and the downs in the story. Things get darker. There's I think the chase scene was to like this really dark drum and bass track that was very high up tempo. So yeah, the music was definitely thought like, okay, we need something for this scene, and so it was, when we even thought through that, even though now the new version of Secret Broadcast, the Redux, is a lot more up tempo. So the whole energy of it now is even more, high key. So
And do you think that changes the reading, like the tone of the reading at all?
it might. I actually think it does make it a little more exciting. To tell you the truth, I think it makes it more like the first one was a lot moodier, a lot.
Well, and
darker.
the
Well,
book itself was
isn't-
black and white.
Yeah, now it's in
Right.
color.
That's
So.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, just because you're the creative forces behind it, then would it be inappropriate to read the black and white edition with the new music, or vice versa? How do you feel about
I don't think
that
it'd be
approach?
inappropriate at all. It would just be maybe it might be kind of different. I mean, the funny thing about you pick up an old comic, in a black and white, and the pages are yellowing. It kind of
It's already color.
It's already this guy, but it's sort of that feeling of that kind of old pulpier, kind of analog reading a comic book, and the CD has kind of got this sort of gritty. We actually record lots of weird like vinyl in it, and it's very garage, so it does really fit the analog comic book kind of reading experience. Whereas this digital version that's kind of sleeker in color, and then all the music's really even more advanced in the sort of production value wise. So they are kind of. I guess you could say that there might be some incongruousness to it if you were.
They both
mixed, but
fit
they-
each other's
but they-
kind of space,
they
but
do.
then we're not purists.
We're not. We're
To that.
If you
to
find
that
the
extent.
old soundtrack and want to listen to it to the digital comics,
yes.
by all means.
Very cool.
Mix and match.
Something you mentioned before that I definitely want to talk to you guys about is Exquisite Corpses. Because that book, I mean, obviously, definitely made an impact.
Yeah, that's another
That was-
book that's kind of gone into obscurity.
Yeah.
Say,
I mean, it was-
not really. Can't really track that one down.
Well, it's
easily.
tricky because I mean it's out there, and even the writer
eBay?
Jerry Prosser,
Exactly, yeah.
eBay. I know. I mean, I mean, I'm sure it was a fairly limited run. I mean, it was a pretty tough book, and they even when it was published, they were concerned about it, and so wrapped them all in individual.
And this was a Dark Horse book.
heat-sealed plastic bags so that they
Wow.
couldn't accidentally be opened by children in the comic stores, and they also didn't want the stores themselves to be put in a potential liable
Which they still
situation.
were.
Yeah, and that book was actually banned in 3 countries. I think it was
Canada, New Zealand, and
England, and we
Interesting.
ended up probably getting arguably the best review on that book from the New Zealand Tribunal that banned it.
Who were
And,
in their rationale for banning it, they recognized its creative merits beyond a shadow of a doubt, but the fact that it was the shape and size of a comic book would be too attractive to a child.
Yeah.
So we were still, that was one of those books that, in a lot of ways, it kind of shocked people, into like, whoa, like pushing this, walking that line, just walking right to the edge. And
Yeah.
maybe
well, and maybe
stepping-
just to kind of describe what the book is for
Yeah.
people that aren't familiar, it was a book about that kind of explored the psychology of a serial killer and it was written as 3 books that didn't have numbers, so you wouldn't know what order to read them in. And they all came out the same day, and the idea was that, depending on what order you read these books in, you may come away with a slightly different kind of moral take on the character, or a different feeling, because each issue kind of explored either the character's brutality or his victimization at some point in his life, and so
ultimately
led to his psychosis. And
as a full-blown serial killer.
And when we got the script, we were just kind of like a little bit shocked by how grim it was and how stark and
but also
graphic.
unapologetic. We were like,
yeah,
this is a pretty.
We liked that.
We liked the challenge of it. So.
But we decided, well, why don't we read these? Because the concept was so brilliant, and we were like, well, why don't we read these in different orders and just see what we come away with, like if we agree with it or if we're feeling it or whatnot. And so we did that, and like I don't remember what our various kind of opinions were on it, but they were really a different interpretation of the character by the time we'd reached the end, and we were like, well, wow, that actually works. That's super cool and intriguing, and so we were like,
nonlinear and really
let's go into that.
I wonder how you'd even collect a book like that.
Well, that's kind of been
why
the
it
issue.
happened.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that Jerry didn't want to collect it in any specific order, which is, you can't argue with that. And but also there was, it was a tough book to. In terms of the subject matter, there's some moments in it that are, pretty, gripping and just, in terms of like what happens to this kid,
And that's one reason why, I mean, we'd actually love to remaster that book because the black and white washes weren't properly photographed at that time. So there's a book there that has not been seen yet as well.
It's also really one of our most, I think, important works in comics. It's actually probably our best in a lot of ways because it was so focused around this very serious theme. We took it very seriously.
Yeah.
We didn't get cheeky about anything. We kind of took a kind of a
forensic approach to it.
Kind of this analysis and kind of extracted this sort of the blood, if you will.
Yeah.
We didn't want it to kind of rely on gore or fall back into that space of like titillation in a way.
Right.
Just this is it. This is this kid being molested by his father. Oh, that's what that looks like, and that's horrifying.
Right.
And so in a way, kind of challenging the reader to look at it and go okay, and then but make it also really beautifully illustrated. Make it like this is not just pulp fodder. This is something that clearly a lot of thought went into, and we wanted that to come through the quality of the artwork.
Yeah.
And because it was a serious tale, and it was very difficult subject matter, but it did actually take the reader somewhere and really make you think about, that things aren't black and white.
Right.
There are terrible people in the world, but there's a cycle of violence. Terrible things happen to them as well. So we just kind of thought, well, let's take this on, and I think it is something you kind of take on maybe when you're younger, and you're kind of like, I'm not going to worry about the implications of this, and I think it did actually help us, kind of even with our peers, like, oh, these guys aren't just the flash in the pan popular artists of their time, but really kind of maybe. I remember when I met Frank Miller for the first time, and he just like of course nerding out and like, oh, great, pleasure to meet you, and it's an honor, and you're a big influence. And he's like, it looks like you're doing some pretty cool stuff too. Like he was like, wow, okay,
that's
so
awesome.
I got his respect. It was like, wow, that meant so much.
Yeah.
Knowing that he had even seen the book. So that was kind of a turning point for us, and I think that helped give us the confidence to really go into our own. Even though we didn't write the book, our adaptation of the script was very much our own. We had a lot of impact or influence on sort of the way it was told.
Yeah. And then, so you were doing that, you said, kind of simultaneously while you were developing Dissident?
Yeah, we'd
XXX,
basically lived in Europe for about a year writing the Dissident, and then came back. And over maybe, 4 or 5
you were
month
refining
period,
it and kind of bringing some of these more political elements
and
to
it was,
it. So.
And that's really when Dark Horse reached out to us with that script, and that became really the doorway into Dark Horse, was doing that with Exquisite Corpse. And then once we kind of did that and delivered it, I think that was when Mike was like, all right, I've been hearing of little murmurs about this other project. I want to take a look at it. And so we went in and had a meeting with him, and then he said, "Yeah, I want to do it." And then we were, as quickly as possible, booking tickets back to Amsterdam and like did a whole another year stint there. And then that whole period happened. Yeah.
Cool. And so then coming out of those books, what was sort of the next step for you guys?
Well, really, like I said, Secret Broadcast kind of was that kind of coming back to comics. Like me, I think we took about a year off, like in the mid-'90s, just to kind of and do some. We got more into the music video stuff too,
right?
More
Yeah,
filmmaking,
I guess
then we
did
basically the Vertigo stuff. Kind of
the Vertigo
Batman. Basically, I mean, it was.
Well, I definitely want to talk to you guys about Batman. I mean, Batman is
it was like getting into
thing
that
for me.
Yeah, the turn of the century, the Y2K.
You're saying Batman's a big deal, John?
Well, Batman's a big deal for me personally. I mean,
he's wearing a Captain America shirt.
I am wearing a Captain America
right,
shirt, but I do have my Batman watch on.
Okay.
Always,
It's always
bat
at
time.
all times, I have the Batman. Yes. It's always bat time. Exactly. I mean, but so that was obviously
one moment to lose.
exactly. That's obviously a big step into, I mean, the most mainstream kind of comics.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting with XXX because the Dissident because it was one of those things where even though the book took a long time, and yes, we had to compromise, and it was still and yes, everybody was reading superhero comics. Suddenly there's Vertigo, and suddenly alternative comics had kind of at that point become somewhat it was part of the vernacular now. There was a place for the genre, and DC and Vertigo really had created that imprint that sort of set the tone for what alternative comics would look like in a lot of ways, and that kind of we just had to kind of find our way into that place, and Karen Berger and Shelley Bond and they definitely had shown interest in what we were doing, particularly with the Dissident project. So we were kind of like, okay, what's a way into this, and so. We were pitching ideas, and eventually they weren't kind of clicking with them yet, and then they actually came to us with a project written by Richard Kadri, who's a kind of cyber sci-fi novelist.
Which
and
is
he had written Accelerate.
And
it was a 4-issue miniseries, but it was also when Vertigo was trying to kind of explore, kind of getting outside of the goth aesthetic and into more this sort of cyberpunk, because it was like turn of the century, getting into Y2K and this kind of there was like
everyone was reading Neuromancer.
Mona Lisa Overdrive, and certainly Richard is in kind of the school of that era. So we were kind of still vibing off of the sort of rebellious style of art, and we were kind of getting into more like a technocratic. We wanted this feel of this to be kind of like, okay, let's feel like we're in this very kind of edgy, urban, but very technocratic. Everything's almost like impacted by technology, or maybe because it's a bit
a little Blade
dystopian.
Runner-y.
I was going to mention. I was going to ask if Blade Runner was an influence on
We
this.
sort of describe it as like
vibe.
it's almost like a Matrix meets the Warriors is kind of how he's
I can see that.
Yeah, it's very much in the style of like because at the same time, like across the sea, we had Ghost in the Shell kind of stuff happening.
Totally, yeah.
But like the whole cyberpunk movement is like you start with Blade Runner and then it just progresses from there.
Exactly.
Like, Blade Runner is scratching the surface where cyberpunk is concerned.
Well, it gets a little tribal, and it's like these urban tribes that are kind of become these little mini communities. And in the case of this, they're like misfits and mutants and body modified android human hybrids, and so there's this interesting kind of band
technological outcasts
and kind of low-level criminals just surviving off of the sort of corpse of future Los Angeles. So it's a very kind of dark tale and a little cynical even, and we were kind of drawing it like these characters are like pretty hard bitten, it's kind of like a future noir, and so we just kind of had fun, did a lot of amazing drawings in that one. Jakob really went deep into the detail, and
Richard would he as a his background is in novel writing versus comic book writing, so he had these extremely elaborate descriptions of the environments and the tone and the mood, and it was great because it really was such a great kind of step off point for visualizing that world.
And the fashion and whatnot, and it allowed us to kind of come back to some of those roots. You know,
Yeah.
That's interesting. A lot of the artists we've talked to, generally when they're like approaching scripts, people coming from a traditional comic book writing background, it's more they have trust in the artist. They kind of go with like and this is happening here sort of a thing.
Right.
What do you think of versus someone who's more traditionally like someone coming from prose who has the more... Well, the only scripts I am familiar with right off the top of my head are Alan Moore-esque, where they just like
heady,
blocks of like, and this is exactly what's happening.
Well, there was a bit of that, like getting
I-
him to not describe the action because we're going to draw that. You know?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, we've worked with a number of different writers and worked with very radically different approaches to writing and communicating with the artists. So it's been cool to kind of just work within these different set of freedoms and constraints. And so like somebody like Matt wrote very minimally. He would be like, here's a paragraph and the next 5 pages happens within this paragraph, and we want it to start with this set of the characters in this situation, and then at the end this is happening, and that gave us this visual storytelling freedom to really move through a whole
I
scene
actually
for
think
pages.
that's one of the reasons that book worked so well. Is he gave us that freedom to kind of play in a way and kind of stretch, and then as a result, he got things that he didn't predict and expect that he liked, and he went, vibed off of and worked into some of the storylines. I think the character of what's his name, the detective character Higgins, I think. He said we said, well, let's give this guy he's just a detective. Well, let's give him something. So we gave him this metal eye, kind of almost like
Oh,
Cyborg
yeah, I remember this character.
Chrome Eye, and his nickname was Chrome Eye. But that wasn't. We just said it was. I mean, I'm sure the drawings just showed up. It's like this guy's got a chrome eyeball, and so we were just like, yeah, let's give him Chrome Eye. And then he started naming him Chrome Eye, and then turning. I think later in the story, he turned it into a lie detector.
Oh, awesome.
So he's like when he's interrogating Brian, the lover of Christine Spar, he's like, "You're lying, I can tell." It's Chrome Eye. So those kind of things would have never happened if you didn't just like let these guys just have fun with it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to be learned from that.
For sure.
To give up some of that micromanagement that a writer sometimes feels.
Well, and then the next working with Barron, he had a kind of an interesting approach. Mike Barron, he would give us like just like a regular piece of line rule paper, and in the middle of it he drew the breakdown of the page, and then there'd be all these little
scribbles
and then all around it would be the dialogue written with little just pencil lines pointing to the stick figures within this little word thing, and then that was interesting because it was like also really like a very clear mandate of like what had to happen, but it was once you got that layout, even that weird quick
couldn't
glimpse,
get it out of your
it's hard to get out of your to like just go and do your own thing, and so that took some getting used to. And then with Richard, he in that situation they had originally I think were planning on 5 issues or something.
Bigger. They
it was bigger and they compressed it, and that that was what really turned it into something that was like just so dense and so compacted that I think it felt a little. It was like claustrophobic for us. But then we thought, well, let's just go with that. Let's become like obsessively detailed about it. So the whole thing is like this dense, claustrophobic, urban kind of crushing environment.
Yeah, for sure.
And then when we actually ended up getting a reversion of rights from Vertigo eventually, and we were able to do the publish it as a graphic novel through Image. And at the time we thought, well, we kind of looked at the original art and we were like, my God, the art looks so cool in black and white, and you really, because it was so detailed, the color almost was too much on top of it. So we thought, well, let's just print it. Let's do a black and white version. And then we were like, well, let's just open it up a little. So we did these double-page spreads that we added to the.
Oh, those
to
were not
this
there
were never
originally.
in the original.
No,
wow.
So we
Series.
added to the graphic novel, and what we did was just let's find like 2 spots per chapter where the world can kind of
interesting.
open up, and breathe, and then let's have Richard. We actually approached Richard about, because we sort of did pretty much the production on this book, and so it was like, well, hey, why don't you give it? Here's the image. Can I give us like maybe 3 to 4 little word bubbles? No dialogue, just little captions that can kind of illustrate this what's the feeling of what's going on. And so he wrote these almost like haikus.
Yeah, it was great.
Throughout them,
Yeah.
to fit with the images. But they that's another. Of course, that one's pretty much very minimal. But but it gave you a chance to kind of see the world that they're in and open things up. So that's the nice thing about this trade that we did. And we actually, for the digital version, went back in and added gray tones.
Okay.
Ironically, we didn't really have the time or budget to get that one colored, even though it would be great to have it colored again. But we so that's got these cool gray tones throughout the digital version. And I should mention real quick that we have all our digital stuff on our digital imprint is Fuse Comics.
Oh yeah, for sure. We should definitely check that out. Accelerate is a very striking book. I was going to say,
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can see the world of it is so immersive. You just sort of pulled into that book. I read it in one sitting because it's just like,
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Nice.
Yeah.
I just got to get to the end of this thing and see where this is going.
What's going to happen? Yeah. And then basically after that, we kind of took.
Well, I guess that
when we
led to
sort of writing-
Batman.
That led to Batman.
Oh yeah,
Through sort of surreptitiously.
Batman. I know because it was like,
what is
yeah,
it like
that
to
was
take
a-
over a character like Batman? I mean, like you're coming into that. What do you kind of go through?
Well, luckily we had this small like Elseworld story that kind of allowed us to dip our toe, as it were, in this Batman Chronicles that we did, and created this kind of cool, weird Y2K story about a girl from an antimatter dimension who finds herself
The Apocalypse Girl.
the Apocalypse Girl, and she finds herself in sort of our dimension, and everything she touches disintegrates. So she's this sort of destructive force, unwitting destructive force, and so Batman is really a detective trying to kind of solve this bizarre high concept mystery.
Yeah.
So that was a very nice little nutshell, very high concept story. In I can't remember issue 30
Sounds like
something.
50 something or
32
30. I don't
or
know.
Anyway, the Apocalypse Girl, you can't miss it.
Yeah, you'll find it.
Red cover. Anyway, so then we had been toying with this idea of a story about Gotham City, and like, wouldn't it be great to what if we did a story where Batman feels that he's no longer relevant in this kind of contemporary vision of a Gotham City that this architect we've created, who's kind of a parallel in a lot of ways to Bruce Wayne, because he too lost his family to a crime, and wants to also sort of find justice and bring sort of rid Gotham of its crime, but through design. And so he concocts this vision of a city of light, a luminescent coating that would coat the buildings to kind of illuminate the city and therefore eliminate shadows by crime that proliferates within the shadows. And so when the story really opens with sort of Batman kind of a typical night in Gotham, breaking up a crime in progress, and beating up these drug dealer criminals, but then in the midst of it there's a kid on a skateboard who kind of wrong place, wrong time, and finds him suddenly like this fire escape comes crashing down and injuring this kid and sending him into the hospital. So Batman sort of goes through this sense of like, wait a second, I'm losing control of my the monster within me, and that kind of, it becomes really a tale of this very psychological self-analysis of like, well, wait a minute, where is
the beast overtaking the
Yeah.
man, and
And
am I relevant? Am I becoming more of a monster than a hero in my own city?
And so he really goes through this process, and it ultimately culminates in this kid, this kind of young artist. We sort of went ahead and we thought, well, let's bring our world into it. Let's bring in the artists. And let's bring in that bohemian world and these kids that are in their kind of like
Art loft.
And one of them's kind of popular and getting popular, and his other kid, his friends are, some of them are competitive and feels like he's a sellout, and he's like suddenly has this painting that has sort of depicts this vision of Batman. Bruce Wayne sees it in this show, and it's like, buys it on the spot, sort of, and it's just these glowing eyes in a cave, and it's just like, but there's no body attached to it, and so he catches wind that this kid wants to paint him, so basically Batman sort of shows up at this kid's sort of in his window, like paint me. I need to, and so it's very like out
Paint
there.
me like one of your French bats.
That's right.
Yeah.
Paint me. I'm ready.
Yeah.
I'm ready for my close-up. So it's very like it gets a little like what's the Dorian Gray?
Yeah, it's got a little part. Yeah, basically the young kid is part of the submergist movement.
Yeah.
You must submerge yourself into the beast before you can become the man.
Yeah.
And
So it is, and so in that, and meanwhile this is all going down. He's poor Batgirl is kind of taking up the mantle and trying to kind of stop this mad bomber who's connected ultimately to this architect's kind of alter ego of manifesting his own dreams of this city of light, but through violence. And so it's a kind of a psychological tale, but it does have a lot of mad bombings and Batman going into a dark. He ends up kind of basically digging his own man-made bat cave into this sort of muddy earth and eating worms, and
it's got there's a little J.G. Ballard in it. I'm realizing. I think it's kind of got like, well, it's, I don't know if you guys have read like Concrete Island, but it's like it's this this guy gets in a car accident and gets stuck on this like weird freeway crossing and becomes a kind of savage beast in there. And so I think
nomad in his own city.
in the city. So there's
We went ahead and just let him be a freak.
Did you have any pushback at that time when you guys are like pitching this story and bringing it about? Were people okay with this? Was this like
I would say that at the time it was the Batman kind of universe was very saturated with a lot of characters, and I think DC at the time editorial. I mean, originally this was going to be an Elseworlds book, and thus some of these kind of more out there concepts. And then and then they were like, well, no, this feels like it could really fit into the regular logic, and they wanted a lot of these books to kind of interweave. And I remember like we did one of the Batman Officer Down books for and so that was like the issue we drew was an issue of Robin. But you had to get an issue of Robin, and you had to get an issue of Batgirl, and you had to get an issue of whatever, Detective Comics, to read that story.
Yeah, they were doing a lot of that.
And so they were doing a lot of this crossover stuff, and Batman City of Light was a finite book, and it was like, but we wrote in the detective characters, and we wrote in the Batgirl, and so we were kind of, again, I think there might have been some fatigue happening with the fans of like, oh, here's another book I have to, buy to fit to follow the series, and I think we kind of fell into this timing of where there might have been some in terms of pushback on that, of like, just that kind of thing of like, oh, I don't want to have to buy another.
Sure. Yeah, it was more fan pushback,
which is not what you want.
Right. I think it's true. I think on the editorial side, I mean, we definitely had to jump through a lot of hoops, and we had our first draft. They were like, hey, you need the Bat Bible, and there was certain things that we would definitely have to adhere to fit within obviously continuity, and
the
and all of that.
Batmobile was all wrong.
Yeah,
of course.
Do you remember certain things that they were like, this is continuity that you have to stick to, like in that?
Well, I think
Bat Bible?
In an early version, I almost feel like we had him like leaving Gotham or something like that, and they were like, Batman would never leave Gotham, like that kind of basic.
Yeah.
Well, unless he's with the Justice League.
Well,
Off to get Ra's al Ghul.
He's grounded,
but he couldn't. You can't see him leave.
Yeah.
So
I just seem so fascinated by like inheriting these long-running characters with these arcs, and like, what are the rules and limitations that you guys are now saddled with?
Right. I do remember being like the fact that we wrote in the Batgirl character.
Which Batgirl?
I'm sorry. This was the Batgirl.
Was this?
I'm trying to remember. I think
Stephanie.
She was the mute.
She was
or
the mute.
Cassandra Cain.
Cassandra Cain.
Yeah, that's right.
Had to be.
So it was Cassandra Cain, and at the time she was really kind of a mute character,
right.
And so they had to get permission from. It was a different editorial kind of staff that was doing that book, and so there was kind of a process of some politics that were going on internally to be able to speak, because we had her speaking, and we actually reduced some of the dialogue to have her be less. But even as I look at it, like I was like, oh yeah, she's talking quite a bit, But it was also the subplot in the story was not just that side of it, but we were taking her into kind of a romantic little story, and on top of it, expanding on her story world involved her being brought up by a mercenary, and so we worked in sort of some of that trauma of like basically her. I think we had a scene like where she's in this movie theater this guy asks her out on a date, and she's like, okay, and then she decides to go out with this guy, a really sweet guy, and in the movie theater he goes to hold her hand and touches her hand, and then suddenly she envisions being with her stepfather, you know, or who this mercenary kind of teaching her how to shoot, and his hand holding her hand to like this is, you know, aim at the victim and kind of like pull the trigger. And so this association with intimacy was very violent. And so, you know, she runs out of the theater and the guy's like, what did I do? Yeah. So these are really heavy moments, you know, for that character to go through in a book that she wasn't even part of. So there was some, like, we had to get those kind of scenes approved because, you know, we didn't want to take liberties to the degree that it was incongruous with her trajectory in her main book. But those are kind of things you just, I think, is pretty par for the course.
Yeah.
But, you know, as far as Batman himself, I think, you know, it was cool. They let us really be creative as long as these certain fundamental things kind of looped back in. And in the end, he does, you know, have to kind of...
It's that classic thing of, like, you know,
Batman
bring us
again.
back to the Batman that we gave you in the beginning, you know, and we brought him through this pretty extreme arc, which was really exciting. But, you know, he, of course, you know, it's a redemption story as well, and a renewal story, and so there's, you know, we do end up with, you know, the Batman we know and love.
Exactly. And this other parallel character kind of flips, and he's the one who sort of ends up in Arkham Asylum, you know. But in a
is that
spoiler alert?
Jeez.
Well,
for that collection.
A villain
that's
goes
happening.
to Arkham? Wow.
Put him over there. Give him a number.
He'll be out soon enough anyway. It's hard.
We'd like that because then I think we get a little royalty if they
bring him back.
That character?
There you go.
We created the Purge. Yeah, the Purge is the name of the character.
Have they brought that character back?
I don't. We haven't seen a royalty check. So
Assuming not. Yeah.
Is that something you guys would want to do more of at some point? Take up one of these iconic
we've
characters?
actually been pitching a number of stories to
very
DC.
cool.
We had a meeting with Dan Didio
very
around Comic-Con, and we actually pitched a number of ideas for the sort of new 52 configuration. But it was one of those things where like, well, we're still working it out, and there's a lot.
They've got 50 more crossovers to figure out.
I don't even know if they really even fully read it. I think what we're in a place now, so kind of getting to sort of up to date is Girl Fiend is kind of our return in a lot of ways to comics.
It was very much promoted that way. I seem to remember it coming out, and they're like, the Pander brothers are back.
Yeah. Well, it's fun. I mean, the last book that we really had done collaboratively writing and drawing together was Batman, and that was 2004. So
it was a good decade. I mean, we went off and made a feature film, and we were making
which was Selfless.
It was called Selfless, and we did. That took about 5 years just of our collective effort. I'd also moved to LA. Sort of going back in time here, when Batman was happening, I was actually living in L.A. Jacob was living in Portland, so we were doing this sort of, working from two cities, and this is before file exchanging. We were like, literally, you got to come down and do some penciling, man. A real commuting, long commute, but that was. Around that time, I did Tasty Bullet with Jonathan Vankin, and that was actually kind of a sparkle in the eye. Still, we hadn't penciled it, but we were pitching it and actually Anonymous Content at one point had optioned it. So there was some buzz going on, and we were putting some energy around our stuff down in LA. So that was kind of happening, and then the movie, we kind of came back and made this movie, and it became kind of our sort of a career shift, if you will. To basically trying to break into indie film, which at that time there were still like indie specialty divisions like Warner Independent and your Fox Searchlights and so on. And so we were trying to find a kind of a story, and actually Secret Broadcast was a screenplay that we had adapted and kind of modified it to the current century, but more technocratic in nature. But the point there was that we couldn't get financing for that, and then we had this other script that was more like a kind of a straight ahead thriller, kind of like almost a contemporary Hitchcock about an architect who's sort of got
identity is stolen.
Identity
but he's kind of he's a very egocentric, kind of self-absorbed architect that his whole sense of self is wrapped up in his work and his achievement, and he basically ends up unwittingly pissing off this
master identity thief.
Stranger who turns out to be a master identity thief at an airport, and slowly, unbeknownst to him, his life becomes picked apart from.
So, yeah, basically everything starts going desperately wrong in his life, but it's one of those things where because of his ego, he's kind of eroded his relationships, his professional and personal relationships. So when the shoe drops, as they say,
it drops real fast.
It drops fast, and he's kind of eroded away his whatever safety net there was, and keeps falling, and so it's one of those tales of having to kind of go to the darkest depths to sort of find yourself again. And so here's this identity theft thriller about a guy who's really has to rediscover who he is if he wants to get his identity back. And so it was a really interesting psychological kind of tale told in a very contemporary, like Pearl District, Portland was really blowing up at the time. It was before the economy completely tanked. So there was this kind of like bubble idealism around design and kind of this new model. But right around the corner was disaster, and we kind of reflected what ultimately happened, because we made this movie, won awards, did the festival circuit, took it to market, and then got a kind of a deal, but there was some devil in the details that we didn't fully.
Yeah. Well, and what it was, we took it to market, and the global economy crashed,
Right,
and so
basically.
we were in the rough seas of that market. The indie divisions had crashed, so we ended. The only deal we could get turned out to be a fairly shady deal. So consequently, the thing is in distribution limbo, which kind of sucks.
And not only that, the title was then taken by a new
Ryan
Reynolds
movie, which we haven't. Titles can be changed, especially when it's unreleased.
Yeah.
But we've done a lot. Like even this last year, we were trying to get through to some of the channels of the distributors, and we saw a light, maybe a glimmer of hope, but then that was dashed. So we really had to kind of let go of that project and move on to new things. In a lot of ways, coming back to comics was a part of that narrative of like, well, we have this other screenplay that we'd written, and we're shopping, but because it dealt with vampires,
right?
And once again, we couldn't get a deal. So we were like, well, why don't we do the comic book? We wrote it as a movie. Let's
adapt it to a graphic novel.
Yeah, and the working title of the movie was actually at one point was True Blood. So we were like, well, that's not gonna,
that's out.
So when we thought, let's kind of take the obvious vampire-ness out of the title, because it's not just a vampire tale. It's really a love story.
Absolutely,
it's
like a detective aspect
kind of a
to it.
crime
as well.
thriller.
Yeah, it's like crime noir.
Little Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, little Bonnie and Clyde. Basically, true romance with fangs. So it's very. We were thinking more Tarantino, more Sin City. It's that gritty vibe.
I was going to ask as well, was Near Dark at all an influence on it? Because the vampire tribe that's kind of hunting her felt a little...
Oh, was that the one with the kind of the hick?
Bill Paxton was in it.
There was a little bit of that.
Just this roaming band of
vampires. That was around the time we were writing it, actually. When I remember we saw that.
Yeah,
I think separately, but
I think Bob Schreck actually he's
Oh, maybe so. Okay.
Yeah, he's like, oh, you guys got to see.
Okay, I saw it.
Knowing Bob Schreck, that makes a lot of sense to me that he'd be way into that movie.
We always talked about monster movies for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So that. May have kind of influenced some of those. Yeah, some of the bad guys.
It's just one of my favorite movies, and so I see this image of them.
There's nothing better than like desperate characters, because they're the ones
nice
that, like,
and unpredictable.
Unpredictable, and they might do anything. And that so these essentially the story follows this couple, this girl Karina, who's sort of a runaway vampire from a rural community seeking love in the big city, and kind of not your typical vampire. She's bubbly and idealistic and cute and romantic.
Just wants to live a normal life.
Yeah, and she basically is looking at the Match.com billboard and doesn't see the car coming, and gets hit by a car, and suddenly she's got this shrapnel sticking out of her chest. Not a direct reference to Iron Man, but so she winds up in the morgue and enter the love interest, Nick, who's the mortician, the sort of like the mortal, but he's totally like he's a cutter, he's gothy, he's depressed,
you'd think he was the vampire.
You'd think he was the vampire, and so he awakens her. He pulls the stake out and reawakens her, and suddenly it's love at first sight. And so it really is like, well, now what? Now what do we do? We're in love. There's the honeymoon phase, and really he has a hard time with her killing the innocent to feed, but for her it's just who she is. It's like, hey, you got to accept me for who I am, and he's like, well, what basically this B story of the biker gang on the run, and they start kind of winding up coming through the morgue by virtue of their own folly, and he starts to Nick starts to see, hey, wait, maybe if you can feed off these guys, they're okay. And it's that whole thing, and they start hunting these criminals down.
Slippery slope of love.
It's the slippery, it's like how far you keep moving the line, and so that's basically what kind of unfolds. And of course, it has a bit of that, like all the players start to kind of converge. The family is tracking her down from the rural community, like because she's also very special for reasons I won't say. And she becomes kind of this like very valuable asset to their community, their vampire community, and potentially a threat for that matter. And then of course the trail of blood only draws the authorities, and who become these sort of pseudo vampires. One of which was a vampire hunter in the past who recognizes her sound and kind of reawakens a lot of his skeletons in the closet, and so he's an interesting character, Drake. So this is we really wrote it as a movie, wrote it to be.
It has that feel to it for sure. And is that something you would still like to pursue at some point, like potentially doing this as a movie? It lends itself.
Oh yeah, definitely. We're kind of looking. I mean, it's interesting because we originally we were like, and it was the way kind of it was. Even 10, 15 years ago, is there was either you're a comic book artist or you're a director or movie, but those two were not kind of integrated. And these days, people are, people that are well-known movie directors are like, oh my God, I really want to do a comic book, and vice versa. And so we suddenly kind of woke up realizing, we're both. Let's pursue both. Let's not go for movies and not do comics anymore, or vice versa. Let's just really start pursuing these both with the same level of passion, because at the end of the day, it's storytelling. By virtue of doing A Girl Fiend as a graphic novel, now that's out in the world. You guys can read it. You guys can share.
I think that was what was so frustrating. Was like we have this great story that we want to tell, and we're thinking it has to be a movie,
right?
And that's silly. I mean, it can be a graphic novel, and the same way when you hear people go, "Oh, that comic could never be a movie." Well, so it could. It just needs to be treated with the right hands, with somebody who understands the material. And
absolutely,
so, I think being a purist these days is a real luxury item. I think you have to kind of, we're now in this age of
we're
convergence.
in a different time,
and you have people that are like gamers that are or that draw a comic, and the comic is sort of like comes out, well, I already did the movie and now I'm doing the comic. And it's like everything's kind of backwards and sideways. And in a way, that's kind of the nature. We're in a nonlinear kind of story world or story
creation.
Yeah, space, space especially with the digital. So our whole thing is just like, well, let's, it's chaotic, it's disruptive, if you will, but it's also the new normal, and we have to kind of embrace it or be kind of tucked away in this corner where you're really not part of the bigger conversation.
Right. I mean, it almost seems like you kind of have to start hopping mediums at this point, or blending them in a certain way. And especially like with Bob Schreck now working at Legendary is very much a company that is doing that actively on a corporate level.
Yeah, and so that's
they're seeing that.
And, they're thinking about movies. They're thinking about stories that can translate well to the movies. And I think the original series thing is also really interesting, especially from a writing perspective, because now we're thinking about, like, how to write a story that isn't so three-act kind of finite and then, with some sort of tendril to a potentially new thing. It's really more, flowing, and it can lead to new places, and it's not locked. I mean, we've kind of... I think
which kind of brings it back
finite
to
stories,
comics in a way. Creating a series, creating a story world that can unfold and kind of go places.
Yeah. And there's always new avenues coming out with that. I mean, every day there's a new streaming service that's making original content as well.
Yeah, I mean, what would be nice is, and what we haven't really seen yet is I mean, I think in the iBooks or whatever, those are where you're starting to see links in the book itself, and PDFs can be interactive, but it'd be great when
you can have a book that's got a video in it, music in it, everything.
I don't know if you guys have ever read House of Leaves, but if that book had, because that book is like, I don't even know, like 20% footnotes, and like there's a whole other B story happening within the footnotes of the book. It's an insane novel.
Yeah, that's cool.
But if that was made today, and they like basically made an entire Wikipedia page for it, and there's like a subplot going on within the Wikipedia page, like there could be stuff like that happening in media that would be
well, and the Easter
really
egg
interesting.
the Easter egg has kind of become synonymous with, like, images in Jessica Jones, or like, did you see the Easter egg? And you're like, kind of like, I don't know, And I remember like there was something about the doorways or like hands on doors, and I was like, going, what's that all about? and so if you kind of freeze frame images and are taken into new places, that kind of content has a lot of potential to take you into completely new realms, different types of media. And of course, like anything, it can be monetizable, and it turns into that.
Sure.
And I'm sure, like the Disneys of the world will love that.
There is only one Disney in the world, and they own everything.
Right.
They are the world.
The Disney of the world.
The other one's being sued right now.
It is a small world, after all.
Except for the Liechtensteins. He was the only one that didn't get sued by Disney.
A few Liechtensteins.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's true, yeah.
So if you try if you dare, right?
But you not only have that, but you also have audiences who are willing to do that and are like wanting to do that. There's a craving for this. People seem to just want more and more content. And
well, it's interesting because we're in this era now of like the devaluation of content and stories. I mean, we're basically barely getting paid what we were able to call a career back. Certainly with indie comics. And so, in that sense, the sort of shrinking of it is against the backdrop of this massive amount of content.
Right.
So, then it really is about that. It's being dictated by the fans, which is a good thing. But people who have come up and are experienced, and that doesn't matter so much. It's really about the vibe, the energy, and who it's for, and so we, us veterans, if you will, it's like we have to. I mean, if we don't have our franchise character established that we can kind of ride on, we in Girl Fiend. Hey, we would love Girl Fiend to take fire because she's a really compelling character, and we are writing a world for her where she can evolve as a character. And it'll be a really exciting, story. But I think, like anything, we're just as hungry as we were in our 20s. I mean, we're a little less naive. I like to think we are. But, we've
a little bit.
But we've done a lot. We've done these graphic novels. We made a feet film. We've done music videos. We're kind of back to we've just done our own imprint. So we're involved. The other thing that came out of all this is just directing commercials. We've directed commercials for Adidas and Panasonic and LG, and I mean big brands. And so we kind of went into that space for a while. I think Tasty Bullet was kind of part of that too.
I could definitely see the influence of that in there.
Branding, and it's still part of what we do. That's kind of our bread and butter. I mean, we can't do these projects really and have day jobs, so we have to really be freelance creators and filmmakers. So it's just you have to do everything. Yeah, it's crazy.
And I think that's the message of this episode, right?
Yeah.
You have to do everything.
Do it all.
Do it all, everybody.
Do it all. Yeah. Very cool. Do you guys have anything for the brothers? I mean, aside from we anytime we have guests on the show, we always like to turn to a segment called Weird Questions with Donovan Eilert.
Oh, yeah.
So if you guys are up for some weird questions, we'll turn things over to Donovan.
All right, guys. I will ask you a question, and then I'll just get an answer from each of you. Unless you want to give the answer in unison, as one voice.
We didn't practice.
Great. So, what is a more creative name for the very boring flathead screwdriver?
Widget face,
side swiveler,
side swiveler, and widget face.
There we go.
All right, I like those.
Okay.
These
Mine's a Dick
get-
Tracy bad guy.
Yeah, that's true.
He probably needs a screwdriver named after him.
Probably. It's his second cousin.
That's right. Do we have too many consonants?
First yes or no weird question, I think.
jeez.
I just want to.
I feel like we
speak in
need
vowels now.
Pepto-Bismol for that.
Kinda. I don't know. Just only bad pronunciation.
All right, fair enough.
Okay.
And I actually got a phone call this morning from Lincoln, the car company, and they want to name a new car after a surname of a Star Trek character. Do you guys have any input what that could be?
Let's see. I would say
That's the weirdest question.
That one's awesome. I feel like I'm failing miserably.
I know.
I keep
Just go Gorn.
Gorn.
Yeah, Gorn again.
Gorn Deluxe.
Yeah.
The Lincoln Gorn.
I like it. I would buy 10 of those. Yeah. That's excellent. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Those are the questions that I have.
This is another amazing edition of Weird Questions with Don Van Eilert. We now turn to the way we end every episode with our recommendation segment, where we recommend comics we think you should be reading. We always like to start with our guests. Do you guys have any comics you think our listeners should be checking out?
Well, the last one I got eyes on was the Lazarus book.
Oh, fantastic.
That was pretty impressive. I didn't read it. I like pictures. I'm a picture person. Sure. I didn't. We were in a comic store flipping through some stuff, but that, just the visuals of that, and again the cinema kind of that's coming through that, and in general, like I think that's been nice to see in comics, is the sort of influence of these movies kind of just finding its way into panel layouts and the sort of like an explosion, really just the technique, the texture. There's just so much great art right now, especially even in the, the real commercial books have this incredible, it's not, it's getting out of that, kind of superhero formula look and really, getting more textured and more realistic. Definitely. And I that excites me, but mostly in the indie comics, just seeing all this kind of young, idealistic kind of tone as well. I think that's really the exploration, the personal exploration you're seeing in the indies is really refreshing.
I mean, Image is just killing it these days with the stuff they're putting out.
Yeah, the Image stuff is really strong. We definitely would love to do more stuff with them, because a lot of our stuff is kind of has a sci-fi edge to it and a cinematic edge. So we're, hopefully would love to work with those guys too. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have one?
I'm just going to go to actually back to some classics that just really I think had a strong impact on me, and kind of are in the spirit of the Dissident is Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which I think is an amazing book. I think is the first kind of comic that I read and actually had evoked a very emotional response. It's a really intimate and powerful piece about the Nazi occupation and genocide, and that's a very powerful and really wonderfully imagined book. I think it's actually not even it's visually imagined, but it's a biographical, I think, to Spiegelman's father or grandfather, parents. And then another book that I don't know, I'm not familiar with the artist, but it's a Japanese book called, I believe it's either Gen or Gen. And it's
about the Hiroshima bombing.
The Hiroshima bombing,
it's
and
really
it's
kind of manga,
really powerful. It's a very dense, beautifully drawn book about a character and his family, and it's seen kind of from the perspective of this family
and a young
boy. The bombing of Hiroshima, and that I think I came across that book when we were in the midst of drawing. I think the Dissident, and there were some scenes in that, the way it kind of just evoked this kind of visceral power of these characters being kind of
obliterated.
We
actually, I think that
found
did
their
inspire,
way into one of the episode or issues or chapters. But it's an amazing.
Dissident gets pretty dark in our story too, and I think that's right. That was inspired by that.
Some of that works. Those are my two.
Mm-hmm. I do want to make one shout out to old school Marvel visionary Jim Steranko.
Oh yeah.
Who a lot. We were really inspired by his deconstruction of the medium and the sort of rule breaking, like that there are no rules as long as it works.
Yeah, and Nick Fury. Agent
I was going to say that Nick Fury stuff is so good.
Yeah, and all those Strange Tales prior to the original series, you can find those old Strange Tales that he appeared in are brilliant. So anyway, that's my shout out to the old school.
There we go.
Yeah, very cool.
Jim Steranko.
Cool. My recommendation this week is a book called Dead Letters. It's by Christopher Sabella, and the art's by Chris Visions. It's cool. It's sort of a noirish kind of crime story, but set in a world that it seems normal on the surface, but the more you dig into it, the stranger it kind of becomes. And it's about this guy who has no memory. And he's being asked to choose between these two warring gangs, but he doesn't even understand the world he's in, and sort of the. I don't want to get too much into it because you've eventually come to understand what the world is, but it's very secretive and it's cool. It's really so you have this guy trying to play along like he understands what's going on, but he really doesn't even know who he is.
Nice.
And you're like, but he's being asked to make these big decisions, like, were you with him or her? And like, I don't know. So it's a very cool and twisty kind of mystery book. It's from Boom Studios.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Nice.
Gorgoni, what do you got?
We've talked about this, the guy writing this book, quite a bit on this podcast. I'm going to be recommending Harrow County by art or story by Cullen Bunn and art by Tyler Crook.
Great book.
Yeah, it's a really, really good, just weird kind of, I don't know, like Southern Gothic is definitely the genre I'd put it in.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very just like grim tale. Well, I wouldn't call it a grim tale, but there's a lot of grim stuff happening in it about this girl who's being raised in this southern kind of out-of-the-way town, and she's slowly finding out that she's linked somehow to this witch that got like killed about 18 years ago, maybe around the time that she got born. That like caused a whole lot of problems for this town, and all of this older generation within this town are kind of like worried that this might be coming back in the form of this young girl who's also uncovering all these like horrible, weird monsters, for lack of a better term, that exist in the shadows in and around this town. There is a skinless boy wandering around doing some things, and his skin becomes her best pal. So that's, it's a strange, weird book, but I really loved it.
Yeah. And what book isn't Cullen Bunn writing these days?
God, he's writing them all. But yeah, Harrow County, it's done by Dark Horse and written by Cullen Bunn and art by Tyler Crook.
Great book. Donovan?
Cool. I just read the first trade of the Charles Soule She-Hulk that Gorgoni loaned me. Really awesome. You start off with Jennifer Walters, and she is called in for a 1-year review at a lawyer firm, and they're like, hey, just so you know, we actually wanted you to bring in all your superhero friends and all their, like, Tony Stark, he's got lawsuits, bring him here. And she's like, nah, it's kind of a separate life. And they're like, okay, well then we'll see you later. And so now she's kind of on her own, and she's still struggling with the identity of being a lawyer and a superhero and all these other things. So, cool. And I think you guys said that Charles Soule was or is a lawyer. Is that right? Or is that no?
No, yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so some of the
I think he still is a practicing lawyer.
So you don't read a lot of good law comics, I feel like, but it's done really well, and it's a really fun, flashy.
He's doing Daredevil now.
And he's doing Daredevil. All
the good wife on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's Charles Soule, and then Javier Pulido is doing a lot of the illustration in that book.
Fantastic.
So it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
A lot brighter, a lot flashier than Harrow County.
Yeah.
I think
for sure.
There's no. I mean, just read the first trade. There's no skinless sort of people yet.
Not yet.
No green skinless.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Yeah. So be sure to check those comics out. And also be sure to check out the Pander Brothers Kickstarter for the Dissident, which goes
We're
through...
going to link that in our Twitter, so follow that.
Absolutely. Which goes through, is it February 25th?
Yeah. And we got a ton of cool rewards. We've got, all our digital stuff is available as a reward. A number of our hard copy, our limited edition graphic novels like Tasty Bullet and the original series of XXX. Accelerate. So some of those books that we have, we're making some of those available, and some of the actual original art from the book, the original book itself. So so we've got a lot and some cool digital prints. So we're going to have a range of rewards.
Yeah, it's a cool project, guys. You should definitely encourage all of our listeners to go and support it because it's pretty cool stuff.
Do you guys have any other web presence you guys want to plug or anything else you want to?
I mean, Fuse Comics is really where a lot of the digital comics are. Girl Fiend comic, Girl Fiend the comic.
Well, it's Girl Fiend Comic. GirlFiendComic.com, and that's got a ton of cool stuff on it. We've actually spent a lot of time on Girl Fiend the last year. So that's that's a lot of fun. That's on Instagram as well, Girl Fiend Comic. And then we've also got, you can always check out panderbros.com. That's where a lot more of our media stuff is, and kind of some more. We actually did a short film last year called Subtext. That's a live action short, all told through texting, so there's no dialogue in it.
It's a really cool idea.
We actually have that one up on Vimeo on demand.
Oh, nice.
Subtext, so people can rent or buy, and then we're on Instagram and Twitter at panderbros.
Yeah, and we're always we actually put a lot of drawings up and sketches and stuff like that on our Pander Bros Instagram, so stuff that you can't see on Facebook. So yeah, please come visit us and check it out.
And of course, you can find us. We are at Panel on Panels on Twitter. We're also on Facebook, Instagram. What are the other ones?
If you really want to talk to us in a long-winded fashion and don't want to be constrained by 140 characters, you can email us at panelonpanels@gmail.com.
Yep, we do read those. So
I mean, yeah, for the most part.
Sure. Just know that there's a person on the other end of those emails.
Look, we've been hurt before.
Cool. Of course, we want to give a big thank you to the Pander Brothers for coming on the show. It was great having you guys.
Thank you guys. That was a blast.
And I guess for Panel on Panels this week, I've been John Campbell.
I am currently Mike Gergoni.
And I will always be Donovan Eilert.
Keep reading comics, everybody.